By 1812, the Treaty of Tilsit between France and Russia had held for 5 years. But cracks were beginning to appear. Both Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I had grand personal ambitions, and neither was too scrupulous about the methods he would use to fulfill them.
In 1807, at Tilsit, Napoleon and Alexander I in effect had done a deal. And that was that Napoleon would dominate Western, Central and Southern Europe, and Alexander I would dominate the East, with a view to looking to the conquest of Constantinople. In other words, they treated each other, on the surface at least, as equals. Despite the fact that Napoleon had just defeated Alexander I, he was offering, as it were, a partition of the world. But with every year that passed after 1807, it became clear that Napoleon simply couldn't tolerate that kind of relationship, and he regarded Alexander I as a vassal, not as an equal or as an ally.
In 1810, following his divorce from the Empress Josephine, Napoleon had contemplated a marriage to the Tsar's sister, Anna. Instead, he had contracted a union with Marie Louise of Austria, much to the Tsar's displeasure. Nor was Alexander pleased at Napoleon's unwillingness to help him take Constantinople. He also feared Napoleon's plans to enlarge the Grand Duchy of Warsaw and revive an independent Poland.
Poland in 1807 was only a fraction of its former self. It had been a massive kingdom stretching a fair way down into Russia, across into the Ukraine, and gradually over the preceding century it had been whittled away into political insignificance. Napoleon recognized that there was a pool of ardent manpower support to be drawn from the Poles. He created the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, which he gave to the King of Saxony to look after for him. This was on the western borders of Russia, and the Tsar was not happy about this recreation because he could see that at some point somebody might take it in their minds to say, okay, from my Grand Duchy of Warsaw, you're now again the Kingdom of Poland, and we'll have half of Western Russia to make you up.
A small section of the Grand Armee was still stationed east of the Elbe. Prince Joseph Anton Poniatowski, one of the marshals Napoleon later called intrepid heroes, warned the emperor that Alexander planned a preemptive strike against them.
I thought that the French Empire, which I had created by so many victories, would be dismembered at my death, and the sceptre of Europe would pass into the hands of a Tsar, unless I drove back the Russians beyond the Dnieper and raised up the throne of Poland, the natural barrier of the empire.
Napoleon very much knew that the Russians always objected to Polish nationalism and the fact that he maintained the Duchy of Warsaw. They even incorporated aspects of the Polish army in his own army. Was a continual thorn in the side of the Russian Tsar.
History Hit is an award-winning streaming platform built by history fans for history fans. Our goal is to bring you award-winning documentaries that cover the events and figures that have shaped our world all in one place. Travel with us to the fascinating world of prehistoric Scotland or uncover the lives of the people who called Pompeii home. We also aim to bring you the stories and legends that shaped our world through our award-winning podcast network. Sign up now for a free trial, and Timeline fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code TIMELINE at checkout.
On 15th of August 1811, the Russian ambassador Kurakin had an audience with Napoleon at the Tuileries. He put forward Alexander's proposal that France should hand over part of the Duchy of Warsaw. Napoleon was furious.
Even though your armies were to camp on the heights of Montmartre, I wouldn't yield an inch of Warsaw. Not a village, not a mill. Don't you know that I have 800,000 troops? If you're counting on allies, where are they?
Napoleon is increasingly looking to first intimidation and to then conquest. It's fair to say that his advisors cautioned him against conquest, or cautioned him against invasion. They argued that it was militarily a difficult task, but also that it diplomatically was in many senses would be foolish. Napoleon, however, was having none of this.
For reasons that I don't completely understand, Napoleon seems to have ignored or refused to understand several warnings of the nature of the campaign of 1812. The Tsar himself told Caulaincourt, Napoleon's foreign secretary, that he would draw the French into Mother Russia and they would face the wrath of the weather and of the peasantry. He said, "Your French soldier is brave and fights well, but he has never had to experience the kind of campaign that he will have if he tries to come into Mother Russia."
The reason that Napoleon went for Russia, despite having been reminded of the catastrophes which overtook Charles XII of Sweden when he tried it, were that he believed his own propaganda by this point. He thought that if he bent his mind to a problem long enough and worked at it hard enough, he would break it. And thus, regardless of all the voices raised against it, he pushed ahead.
Napoleon was never a person to take advice, least of all about military matters. He'd always been proved right in the past. And again, we have a very striking analogy between Napoleon's attitude towards advice of this kind and that of Hitler after 1939, who was constantly ignoring advice from his advisors, not least about the possibility, the feasibility of a campaign in Russia after 1941. So I think it can be explained only in terms of Napoleon's peculiar psychology, especially after it has enjoyed now a decade or more of apparently unbroken success.
Napoleon set about organizing provisions. This time he would not repeat the mistake of Spain and rely on living off the land. He gave orders to his Director of War Administration to supply enough provisions to last 400,000 men 50 days. As well as the basics of bread and rice, he requisitioned 6,000 wagons to carry enough flour for 200,000 men for 2 months, and 2 million bushels of oats for his horses. This was on 13th January 1812, and Napoleon expected it to be ready in time for what he referred to as the Second Polish War. In April 1812, Alexander issued an ultimatum to Napoleon: evacuate all troops from Prussia and the Grand Duchy. For Napoleon, though, there was no going back. The Grand Armee consisted of 3 groups. The First Army Group comprised 250,000 men, the second 150,000, and the third 165,000. Small wonder he thought himself invincible.
In 1812, prior to the invasion, which begins in late June, he organises a formidable coalition and calls on troops from throughout Napoleonic Europe. Both the Prussians and the Austrians are dragooned into supporting the invasion, and large numbers of men are deployed, for example, from Napoleon's Kingdom of Italy, from the various German principalities, large numbers of Poles. Now, the size of the resulting army is a matter of some controversy. We do not have an accurate figure. The usual figure given is about 600,000 men. I think it's certainly fair to say that we're probably talking of over 500,000 men in the invading force.
In 1812, Austria, Prussia, Germany, Switzerland and Italy marched under the French eagles.
Was it not natural that I should think the moment had come to consolidate the great edifice I had raised, but on which Russia would lean with all her weight as long as she could send her numerous armies at pleasure to the Oder?
On 24th June 1812, the Grand Armee crossed the river Niemen at Kovno. Napoleon travelled in a green four-wheeled covered carriage pulled by 6 Limousin horses. Marshal Berthier travelled with him, acting almost as his private secretary, as the Emperor dictated his dispatches to him. So fast did they travel that water regularly had to be poured over the wheels to cool them. Napoleon was a stickler for the tiniest detail when it came to the care of his men. Finding on one occasion that there was a shortage of medical dressings, he berated his quartermaster.
On average, a wounded man needs 33 dressings. These brave fellows are going to face death for me.
The Grand Armee had everything it needed for the campaign that it was undertaking. The problem was getting the supplies to the soldiers in the front. It was such an enormous army that it absolutely clogged the roadways, such as they were, and the baggage train in the rear could never get up to the front and keep the men supplied. So there were some serious problems that way. There is such a thing as an army that is simply too big for the task at hand. And I think you can argue very successfully that the Grand Armee of 1812 going into Russia probably should have been about half the size that it was.
Napoleon's hope was that he could lure the Russians into a position from which he could split them up and defeat them. He believed he could force the Tsar into signing a peace treaty in just 9 weeks.
What Napoleon really wanted to do is do what he had done against Austria in 1805 and Prussia in 1806, which is to advance on the opponent's capital and to dictate terms. A short, quick war is what his army was prepared for and what his resource base permitted. And that was what he invaded Russia for. He hoped to envelop the opposing armies close to the frontier, and having destroyed them or defeated them, to then have a rapid advance. In other words, to have the equivalent of his Ulm and then his advance on Vienna. And that was what he hoped for in 1812. And that was one of the reasons why the French advance, and the French allies advanced on such a broad front in order to give them a basis for envelopment.
To the north, the Russian First Army was under the command of Barclay de Tolly. It consisted of 125,000 men and 600 guns. To the south, Prince Bagration led the Second Army, comprising another 47,000 soldiers.
It is easy sometimes to overestimate the strength and power of the Russian army that Napoleon faced. It also was a divided army under de Tolly and Bagration. It didn't always have as good a communication amongst its leaders. In fact, those two generals really didn't like each other at all. And so there wasn't nearly the cooperation between them that there might have been. 2 or 3 times, Napoleon's soldiers should have been able to trap or encircle one or the other of those 2 branches of the Russian army, but they always managed to slip out, more because of problems on the French side than because of any brilliance on their side. The fact of the matter was that the Russian army was not all that great, and had they ever stopped to give full battle, they almost certainly would have been defeated.
The Russian army was a badly led army of robots. The Russian soldier was a peasant who was press-ganged effectively into the army. He had no say in the matter, he wasn't a volunteer, and he just did as he told. It was indicative of the peasant system that was prevalent in Russia at the time, and indeed went on being prevalent into the middle of the 19th century. The Russian peasant was very much programmed to fight as he was directed. All that the officer corps had to do was to push the Russian soldier in the right direction, and he would go, or tell him to stop there, and he would stop. The Russian soldier had no initiative whatsoever. He wouldn't run away unless he was told to run away, and he wouldn't advance unless he was told to advance.
Napoleon was in good spirits. On 9th June, he wrote to Marie-Louise from Danzig.
My health is very good. Despite my cares and exhaustion, I feel there is something missing. The sweet habit of seeing you several times a day.
Napoleon hoped to fight Barclay at Vilna, but the Tsar had already ordered his commander to withdraw from there. With 180,000 men, Barclay marched to Vitebsk. From there, he moved on to Smolensk, where he joined up with Bagration's Second Army. Napoleon pursued them.
It was then that I executed the fine manoeuvre, which was the counterpart of one I directed at Landshut in 1809. Using the forest of Babonarinsky as a shield, I turned the left of the Russian army, crossed the Dnieper and advanced on Smolensk. I reached the city 24 hours before the Russians, who happened to be in Smolensk, succeeded in defending it for 1 day, which gave Barclay de Tolly time to reach it.
Bagration accused Barclay of cowardice when the latter ordered the evacuation of Smolensk after 2 days of fierce fighting. In Bagration's eyes, it was tantamount to treason and a betrayal of the heroic Russians who had died. On the night of 17th, 18th August, the fleeing Russians burned Smolensk.
There's no doubt that during the early stages of the campaign, in 1812, the Russians were in no position to face the overwhelming might of the Grand Army, and so they did the sensible thing and retreated. And it remains a point of some controversy as to whether this was a deliberate strategy on their part, luring Napoleon ever further into the wastes of Russia, where they could perish of their own accord, or whether it was something they did because they could do no other. They couldn't stand and fight because they would get crushed, so they keep moving backwards until eventually they have to stop for the good reason that Moscow, as the ancient capital, could not be abandoned without a fight.
As the French army advanced deeper into Russia, they found villages burnt and additional food unobtainable. Thousands of horses died.
The Russians devised what turned out to be the best policy, which was using the space of Russia to pull back. And of course it ensured that by the time that Napoleon's forces met the major Russian field army, he had lost large numbers of men.
Napoleon, though, had lost little of his confidence.
I have a good job ruling the empire. I could be in Paris, enjoying myself, blazing about. Instead, here I am with you, camping out, and, in action like anyone else, I can be hit with a bullet. I'm trying to rise above myself. Everyone in his own station must do the same. That's what greatness means.
When it comes to the Russian campaign, the most important battle, of course, was the Battle of Borodino. But we need to remember that Napoleon never should have been at Borodino to begin with. The absolute furthest he had ever any intention of going was Smolensk. And before Smolensk was Vilna. At Vilna and again at Smolensk, he almost was able to force the battle that he needed. And each time the Russians managed to escape. Now at Smolensk, the question was, do you stay here for the winter or do you go forward? You could argue very successfully, I think, that this was one of Napoleon's major miscalculations in going forward. But he still didn't have that battle. It was so close and yet still so far. And so he determined that he would pursue the army all the way to Moscow if necessary.
Under pressure from his ministers, Alexander halted the withdrawal and concentrated on saving Moscow. Barclay de Tolly was replaced by General Kutuzov, who was still smarting from his defeat at Austerlitz. On 6 September, the two armies faced each other near the village of Borodino. Napoleon was unwell. The dysuria still troubled him, and he had a feverish chill. His spirits lifted with the arrival of a package, a portrait of his young son, the King of Rome. He proudly showed it to his fellow officers.
Gentlemen, if my son were 15, believe me, he would be here in person.
That night he had only 2 hours' sleep. At 3 a.m., in the biting wind and rain, he reconnoitred the surrounding countryside. The area was heavily wooded, making it unsuitable for cavalry. Also, the Russians were dug in on sloping ground, their batteries protected by redoubts. The armies were almost equally matched in numbers. The Russians had 120,000 men and 640 guns, the French 133,000 men and 587 guns. Napoleon's plan was that his stepson, Eugene, would attack the village of Borodino, making the Russians think that the main French thrust was coming from their right. Instead, Napoleon planned to send his main force against the Russian centre and left. Marshal Davout would attack Prince Bagration, whilst Prince Poniatowski's cavalry would circle behind Bagration's lines.
Borodino was a very disappointing battle from the point of view of the admirers of Napoleon. There was none of the clever preliminary diplomatic political manoeuvring to get the enemy into the right position. This was just going to be a bloody slogging match. Davout suggested that there should be a great sweep around the southern flank. Unfortunately for Davout, he was shot down in flames by Napoleon, who considered it to be too complicated. What Napoleon wanted was something very simple. We'll just go and crush them.
On the morning of the battle, Napoleon's officers were arrayed in their most glittering uniforms. On the face of it, this was folly. They would be sitting targets. On the other hand, their deeds of glory would be more visible. Still unwell, Napoleon took up position a mile from the southern Russian redoubts, with a view of the central third of the battlefield and the main French batteries in front of him. At 5:30 a.m., Napoleon ordered them to open fire. The Russians replied at once. The earth trembled.
Borodino is one of the great battles of the century. More than 1,000 cannon, I think about 1,227, and about 233,000 men fought on that day. And that was a pretty unprecedented force. It also, incidentally, therefore caused unprecedented problems for command and control. It's very difficult for armies, after all, they don't have radios. I mean, instructions are sent by men on horseback. Attempts at signalling instructions are not easy on a battlefield of that type, particularly once you've fired the cannon and you've got a lot of smoke up. It's very difficult to control and command what's going on. And I think it's fair to say that Napoleon did not show his best side as generalship.
As planned, Eugene launched his assault on Borodino. Davout attacked the redoubt known as the Three Arrows, where Prince Bagration and 30,000 Russians were waiting. Davout's horse was killed under him, and he was swiftly replaced by Jean Rapp, Napoleon's aide, who was himself wounded. In the meantime, Marshal Ney had captured the southernmost gun emplacement. Murat and the cavalry were sent to help him hold it. The Russians refused to surrender. Napoleon determined to root them out.
They are citadels that have to be demolished with cannon.
Napoleon remained behind his own lines, listless and indecisive. Ney was furious.
Why is the Emperor in the rear of the army? If he is no longer a general, then he should go back to the Tuileries and let us be generals for him.
By 10 o'clock, Eugene had taken Borodino, and Prince Bagration lay mortally wounded. Poniatowski, though, was unable to take the 3 arrows from behind. Shortly after 10, Ney begged Napoleon to attack the 3 arrows with his guard. Napoleon consulted Marshal Bessières, commander of the guard. Bessières counselled prudence.
Will you risk your last reserves 800 miles from Paris? No. Suppose there's another battle tomorrow.
Instead, Napoleon sent a fresh division under General Friant. It was not enough for Ney to be able to force a victory. Action was centred on the Great Redoubt. This was defended by Barclay de Tolly with 75,000 men and 27 guns. Amongst those who attacked the Great Redoubt was Captain Francois of the 1st Division.
When we reached the crest of the ravine, we were riddled with case shot from this battery and others flanking it, but nothing stopped us. Despite my wounded leg, I did as well as any voltigeur in jumping away from round shot as it ricocheted into our ranks. Whole files, half platoons even, went down under the enemy's fire and left huge gaps. General Bonamy, at the head of the 30th, halted us in the middle of the grape shot. He rallied us, and we charged again. A Russian line tried to stop us, but at 30 yards range we fired a volley and passed through. Then we dashed towards the redoubt and clambered through the embrasures.
Francois and his division were driven from the redoubt. Francois fainted from loss of blood and was taken from the field to have his wounds tended. The surgeons were kept busy. Dominique Larrey, the senior surgeon, amputated 200 limbs during the course of the battle. The Great Redoubt was finally captured in the late afternoon following a fierce assault from Prince Eugène, Ney and Murat. The Russians were allowed to withdraw towards Moscow in good order.
Napoleon wins the Battle of Borodino, technically, because the Russians leave. But the Russians leave because they are most of all wanting to keep their army intact. And since they do that, you have to argue that it was at best a draw. One side wins, holds the battlefield, and goes on to Moscow, but the other side keeps the army intact to fight yet another day.
After the battle, the dead were counted. The Russians had lost 44,000 men, the French 33,000. Amongst the corpses, the occasional soldier still clung to life. Finding a wounded Russian, Napoleon ordered his wounds to be tended. When his aide objected, the emperor reprimanded him.
After a victory, there are no enemies, only men.
It was the quality and determination of the Russians that inflicting heavy casualties that really led to the important net effect of the battle, which is that it is a far weaker Napoleon, and in some ways almost a psychologically exhausted Napoleon, that advances on Moscow.
At last, on 13 September, he reached the outskirts of Moscow. Sergeant Burgoyne of the Old Guard was overwhelmed by his first sight of the Russian capital.
The sun was reflected on all the domes, spires, and gilded palaces. Many capitals I have seen, such as Paris, Berlin, Warsaw, Vienna, and Madrid. They only produced an ordinary impression on me. But this was quite different. The effect was to me, in fact to everyone, magical.
Two days later, the French entered Moscow. It seemed strangely deserted. The governor, Rostopchin, had ordered a mass evacuation of the city. Of its population of 250,000, only 15,000 remained. Napoleon made himself at home in the Kremlin and waited for Alexander to seek peace. Instead, he had to contend with a series of fires within the city, started on the orders of Rostopchin. Aware that the flames were rapidly approaching his ammunition wagons, Napoleon ordered everyone to leave the Kremlin. he headed for the Petrovsky Palace, 6 miles north of the blazing city. 80% of the houses in Moscow were destroyed in the fire. The Kremlin suffered little damage, and on 18 September, Napoleon and his army were able to return there.
Now, in many senses, this was a great triumph. And after all, if one compares it to 1941, nobody else has subsequently been able to seize Moscow. But in many senses, what was he now to do? He hadn't really thought through the political strategy, because a military result, capturing the opponent's capital, was not itself enough unless your opponent was willing to negotiate. And one of the problems was that Napoleon had no way to force his opponent to negotiate, and in fact had no real terms to offer him. Hadn't really thought through a peace strategy.
He sends out his emissaries, they're all turned back. It is clear that Napoleon is not going to get the negotiations for which he had hoped. Now he has to decide, what do you do?
He was between a rock and a hard place at that time. If he stayed in Moscow, he would, or his army would just die away. If he withdrew to Smolensk, this was a massive blow against his prestige. And although he ignored the fact, his army was down to about 30% of its marching value at this stage, and it was in a pitiful condition.
I don't think he could have wintered in Moscow. There simply wasn't a supply there to sustain them through the winter. It was bound to be a very long one. And of course the situation had not been helped by the fact that the retreating Russians had fired the city before they pulled out. I think it's clear that it was a deliberate act, and it wasn't an accident. So with a large part of Moscow burned down, the countryside around stripped bare, they couldn't stay for long. Napoleon hung on, expecting, hoping, and eventually probably praying that Alexander I would be sending emissaries to negotiate a peace. But with every day that passed, it became less likely.
The emperor remembered the fate of Charles XII of Sweden, who had lost horses, cannon, and 2,000 men to the cold of a Russian winter. He grew impatient, ignoring sound advice, confident in his own judgment.
We shan't repeat Charles XII's mistake. When the army has rested, while the weather is still temperate, we shall return via Smolensk to winter in Lithuania and Poland.
Napoleon began to study weather patterns in Russia. It was now October. Frosts often set in by November. He had to move at once. On 15th October, 3 inches of snow fell on Moscow. Still expecting a reply from the Tsar, Napoleon stayed put. 3 days later, Murat was caught unawares by an attack from Kutuzov. He lost 2,500 men. Napoleon at once gave the order to leave Moscow. At 2 p.m. on 19th October, the Grand Armee, many clad in sheepskin jackets, fur bonnets and fur-lined boots, began to file out of Moscow. They carried sugar and brandy, and their wagons were loaded with treasure looted from the Russian capital. There were enough provisions to last the troops 20 days, but less than a week's supply of fodder for the horses. The march was orderly, but slow. On the 6th day, they were attacked by a band of 5,000 Cossacks. They could so easily have captured Napoleon, but preferred the loot in the French wagons. In the end, they were dispersed by 2 squadrons of French cavalry. Further trouble awaited Napoleon.
Now he has another problem. He wants to take the southern route back. He doesn't want to go back through Borodino and Smolensk. The land had been ravaged, there were dead bodies everywhere. This is not a winning proposition, plus it's further north, it's colder. He wants to go to the south. He has a skirmish with the Russian army. He wins that skirmish. The Russians go beyond a ridge. He's convinced that the Russian army is blocking his path to the south. And so he heads north, the way he didn't want to go. Had he sent someone to reconnoiter over the ridge, he would have discovered the Russian army had gone and the way was open to go back through Minsk and through a much warmer and more hospitable climate with more food and so on.
As October drew to a close, snow was succeeded by severe frost and bitter winds. By 6 November, the temperature was down to minus 22 degrees centigrade.
Snow fell in enormous flakes. We lost sight of the sky and of the men in front of us.
Lips became cracked. Noses were frostbitten. Many were permanently blinded by the glare. They also faced risks from the serfs, who were under orders from their masters to offer hospitality to the French. They were then to get them drunk and slit their throats. An English observer with Kutuzov witnessed some of the atrocities.
I saw 60 dying naked men, whose necks were laid upon a felled tree, while Russian men and women with large faggot sticks, singing in chorus and hopping around with repeated blows, struck out their brains.
Supplies were rapidly running out, and many ate the congealed blood of dead horses. Others disemboweled the wretched animals and sheltered from the cold inside the hollowed carcasses. Dead soldiers were unceremoniously stripped of their clothes and their bodies left for the wolves.
The French army was unfortunate in the winter of 1812-1813, in so much as that it was one of the coldest winters that Russia had suffered in recent times. They suffered very badly. They also suffered from the fact that Napoleon believed that the whole campaign would be over before the winter came, and so they marched into Russia with very little winter clothing. And the tales tell of valuable paintings being burned just simply to be able to keep them warm during the very, very cold nights.
The retreat itself did not have to be a debacle, but it was. In part because of the weather and the effect of the weather, extreme cold, as far as I think about the people from the Kingdom of Italy, for example, the effect of extreme cold on troops who were unprepared for it psychologically, but also simply did not have the necessary clothing. Also the attacks by the Russians. Now, there has been the argument that the Russians could have been more successful. They could almost have destroyed all of the French forces. But nevertheless, they still killed a lot, and a lot died.
What remained of the army reached Smolensk on 8th November. Ahead lay the Beresina River, and 2 armies of Russians were moving in from the north and the south.
By the time the Grand Armee, or what was left of it, reached Smolensk on the way out of Russia, it was in an absolutely pitiful state. Smolensk contained large magazines, which were specifically designed to be used by the army. But the officials in charge of those magazines refused to believe that this horde of dirty, unwashed, ragged, starving men were the Grand Armee. They thought they were stragglers. So they closed the doors of the magazines to these unfortunates who were literally fighting for their lives. The result was that several of these magazines were stormed and looted, plundered. Wherever alcohol came into the game, the guys died like flies because they were in such emaciated, poor physical condition.
So far as the Grand Army was concerned, Napoleon had led them into what seemed to them, to the majority of them anyway, into hell. And although I think Napoleon is still capable of commanding the loyalty of those in his immediate entourage and the veterans who'd served with him in the glory days, for the great majority of the Grand Army, most of whom were not even French, why should they feel any sense of affinity with the man who'd done that to them?
Many within the French ranks were talking of capitulation, and Napoleon was forced to address his troops in a speech that made a deep impression on Sergeant Burgoyne of the Old Guard.
It was a splendid moment, and for a time made us forget our miseries.
By the time the French reached the Beresina River, it was a raging torrent, 300 yards wide. There were 49,000 men and 250 guns left. Under 3 commanders, 144,000 Russians were moving in upon them. Napoleon now needed to hold off an enemy that outnumbered him 3-1, whilst bridging the river and getting his men to safety. Napoleon heard there was an unmarked ford 9 miles upriver. It was 100 yards wide and 6 feet deep at its deepest point. As a decoy operation, he sent Marshal Oudinot 6 miles downstream to fell trees and make as much noise as possible. It worked. The following day, Admiral Chichakov, who was stationed on the opposite bank, took his force of 34,000 men downstream. Napoleon set to work to build 2 bridges. His men worked solidly for 24 hours, pausing only briefly for the occasional ration of wine.
The crossing of the Beresina in late November 1812 by Napoleon in the face of the closing forces of Russia was a masterpiece of luck and human endeavour. By carefully sending out false signals and making dummy preparations to cross the river upstream from his intended bridging point at Studienka, Napoleon won himself a day. The inertia of the Russians and their unwillingness to believe the reports that they received about the true state of the Russian army also played into his hands. Kutuzov and the other Russian commanders could not believe that the massive 500,000 strong Grand Armee was now nothing but a skeleton and a pack of refugees.
On the afternoon of 27th November, Napoleon and the Guard crossed the river. Discipline broke down as men rushed for the bridges. 2 days later, the crossing was complete, apart from 8,000 émigrés and stragglers, men, women and children, who refused to cross and were cut down or captured by Prince Wittgenstein and his army of Cossacks. In the meantime, in Paris, General Claude Mallet attempted a coup with the assistance of 1,200 National Guards. Armed with forged papers announcing Napoleon's death, he arrested the prefect of police. When news reached Napoleon, his first thoughts were for his young son. He determined to return to Paris at once. With the temperature down to minus 25 degrees centigrade, Napoleon set off by sleigh, swathed in bearskin. Privately, he admitted he had made 2 key mistakes. The first had been in July.
I should have remained in Vitebsk. By now, Alexander would have been on his knees to me. The dividing of the Russian army after the Niemen crossing amazed me. As the Russians had not been able to defeat us, and as Kutuzov had been forced on the Tsar in place of Barclay, who was the better soldier? I believed that a people who allowed a bad general to be foisted on them would certainly ask for terms.
His second mistake, he felt, was staying too long in Moscow.
I thought I should be able to make peace, and that the Russians were anxious for it. I was deceived, and I deceived myself.
On 18th December, he arrived back in Paris, where he was united with his wife and son.
In a way, the fact that Napoleon was not toppled by a coup in his capital, when it became known that the Russian campaign had ended in disaster, is a tribute to the remarkable long-range power of his charisma and the loyalty of those who served him in the central institutions.
Murat had been left in charge of the remnant of the army, where he struggled to maintain discipline. When the Russians stormed Vilna, Murat handed over command to Eugène and returned to Naples. Prince von Schwarzenberg withdrew his Austrian troops. Marshal Berthier summed up the general mood.
Every human effort is lost. One can only resign oneself.
Only 25,000 made it back across the Niemen. About 160,000 horses and 1,000 guns had been lost.
The defeat of Napoleon was to help, in the short term, engender a powerful upsurge of Russian nationalism. But in the longer term, it plays a major role of moulding our interpretation of his personality and his policies. It's interesting to consider how we would have perceived Napoleon had he not invaded in 1812. But it is a testimony to the legacy of that invasion on our collective imagination that we cannot do so.
Writing his memoirs on St. Helena, Napoleon did not regard the expedition as a total failure.
The campaign of Russia was the most glorious, the most difficult, and the most honourable to the Gauls of all that are recorded in ancient or modern history. Intrepid heroes, Murat, Ney, Poniatowski, it is you that the glory of the victory is due.
The underlying objective of Napoleon in Russia, as Napoleon in Austria in 1809, as Napoleon in Spain all the way through, was the survival of his own self, of his own dynasty on his newly won thrones. He was clear in his own mind that he would have to continue doing this, and after Russia, who would it be? Still, good old Britain.